Welcome back to another episode of Smooth Brain EDH, where we make the smoothest plays with the biggest brains. If you've been scouring YouTube for some good Commander content, you're in luck because you just found it. Let's not waste any more time and talk about the decks. First up is Chandler on Atraxa, Praetor's Voice. This 4-color Super Friends deck plans to keep the board clear so that it can land powerful planeswalkers and take over the game. His opening hand has a Verdant Catacombs, Waterlogged Grove, Forest, Noble Hierarch, Dovin's Veto, Inexorable Tide, and Contagion Engine. Next up is Matt on Chatterfang, Squirrel General. Matt's game plan is to generate a ton of tokens off his commander's ability to create a ton of squirrels and overwhelm opponents. He starts the game with 2 forests, a swamp, Cabal Coffers, Ravenous Squirrel, Healing Technique, and Freyalise, Llanowar's Fury. Third is Shelby on Oloro, Ageless Ascetic. This deck plans to land powerful effects that trigger on his upkeep, then tries to find ways to have multiple upkeep steps to generate a ton of value. His opening hand has a Plains, Fabled Passage, Drowned Catacomb, Soul Ring, Smothering Tithe, Sun Titan, and Approach of the Second Sun. Last is Ethan on Hans Eriksson. He plans to manipulate the top of his library in order to cheat massive creatures into play and smash opponents' life totals to 0. He starts the game with a Shelter Thicket, Temple of Abandon, Soul Ring, Scroll Rack, Hammer and Vazon, Rampant Growth, and Rhythm of the Wild. You've seen the decks in the hands, now let us know who you're rooting for in the comments below. While you're down there, make sure to give us a like and subscribe. Now, on to the gameplay.
Alright, here we go. Chandler goes first, and he plays a Waterlogged Grove, taps it for a green, taking a damage, and casts a Noble Hierarch before passing. Matt will play a Forest, tap it, and cast Ravenous Squirrel, and pass to Shelby, who will gain 2 life on his upkeep. And Shelby will play a Plains, and cast his turn 1 Soul Ring. He'll then pass to Ethan. Ethan will play his Temple of Abandon, scry 1 to the top, and pass the turn to Chandler. Chandler plays his Catacombs and passes. Matt plays a Swamp, swings 1 at Shelby, and passes to Shelby. And he'll gain 2 on his upkeep. Now on his main phase, he'll play a Fabled Passage as land for turn, and then tap for 1 to cast Authority of the Consuls. He fetches for a Swamp and passes the turn to Ethan. Ethan plays his tapped Sheltered Thicket, and then casts a Soul Ring into a Scroll Rack. And Chandler, knowing that Hans Eriksson with an active Scroll Rack is absolutely terrifying, he decides to take 1 to his land and Dovin's Veto it. And Ethan then passes the turn to Chandler, who forgets to fetch on his end step. Chandler will then play a tapped Water Grave and swing for 1 at Shelby. He'll then pass the turn to Matt. Matt will play another Swamp, tap for 3 mana, and cast a Phyrexian Arena. He'll then move to combat and swing for 1 at Shelby. The turn is then passed to Shelby, who will gain 2 on his upkeep. And he'll play a Drowned Catacomb as land for turn. He'll then tap for 4 and cast a Smothering Tithe. Shelby will then pass the turn to Ethan, who doesn't pay for the Tithe. And Ethan will start off with a Kodama's Reach, and he'll find 2 forests with this. He'll then play 1 as land for turn and cast a Rampant Growth. And he'll find a Snow Forest to the battlefield tapped with this one. Ethan will then pass the turn, and on his end step, Chandler will fetch with his Verdant Catacombs and find an Indatha Triome to the battlefield tapped. Now on his turn, he doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, plays a Tropical Island as land for turn, and casts a tapped Atraxa, and Shelby will gain a life. He'll then move to combat and swing 1 Exalted at Shelby. He'll then pass the turn to Matt, who will draw an extra card and lose a life on his upkeep. And he will not pay for either of the Smothering Tithe triggers. He then plays Overgrown Tomb tapped as land for turn, and then will tap for 3 and cast his commander, Chatterfang. It enters tapped, and Shelby gains a life. Matt will then move to combat and swing 1 at Shelby, then pass the turn to Shelby, who will gain 2 life on his upkeep. He'll then play a Vault of Champions as land for turn, tap his Soul Ring for 2, and cast a Talisman of Hierarchy. He'll then sacrifice 2 treasures and tap completely out to cast an Approach of the Second Sun. He'll gain 7 life and then put it back into his library, 7th from the top. He'll then pass the turn to Ethan. Ethan will not pay for Smothering Tithe, and then on his main phase, he'll cast a Druid of Purification. It enters tapped, and Shelby will gain a life. Ethan votes for Smothering Tithe, Chandler votes for Soul Ring, and Matt votes for Authority of the Consuls. Unfortunately, Shelby got hit with 3 out of the 4 choices there, so he decides to hit Matt's Phyrexian Arena. Ethan will then play a Forest as land for turn, and tap for 3 to cast a Rhythm of the Wild. He will then pass the turn to Chandler, who plays a Nurturing Peatland as his land for turn. He'll then move to combat and swing 5 Lifelink Commander at Shelby. He'll then tap for 6, losing 2 to his lands, and will cast an Elspeth Sun's Champion. He'll uptick her and make 3 1/1 soldiers. He then passes turn to Matt and proliferates Elspeth. He does say this, but forgets to actually change the dice. He'll catch this later. Now on Matt's turn, he'll play a forest as land for turn. And he'll tap out to cast a Frey Elise, Llanowar's Fury. He'll upticker to make a Llanowar Elves and a 1/1 Squirrel. He'll then move to combat and forest walk Chatterfang all the way over to Elspeth. He then passes turn to Shelby, who decides to hop right in, tap for 6 mana, and cast his Sun Titan. He'll get back his Soul Ring, which he'll immediately tap and then sacrifice a treasure to cast As Foretold. After this, he'll pass the turn to Ethan, who will start his turn off by casting his commander, Hans Eriksson. And as you could probably guess, Ethan will give him haste with the Riot trigger. Then tap for 4 and cast a Hammer of Nazan, which he will immediately equip to, you guessed it, Hans Eriksson. He'll then swing 3 at Elspeth and blind flip into a Mending Touch, which will go to his hand. Chandler will block with Atraxa and gain 4 life. Ethan then plays a mountain and then passes the turn to Chandler, who starts his turn off with a forest as land for turn. He'll then tap for 5 and cast an Inexorable Tide. He'll then uptick Elspeth to make 3 more 1/1s, and then move to combat and swing for 5 in the air at Frey Elise. Chandler will then pass the turn and proliferate Elspeth. Now on Matt's turn, he'll play his Cabal Coffers as land for turn. He'll activate the coffers to make 3 black mana, then tap a forest and activate Ravenous Squirrel to sacrifice a squirrel with 1 black floating. He'll gain a life and draw a card. With that 1 black floating, Matt taps for 3 more and casts a healing technique. He decides to demonstrate it, but doesn't know who to give it to. Everybody has a decent argument, but Matt ultimately listens to Chandler, who says he needs the Dovin's Veto back to prevent Shelby from casting the Approach of the Second Sun again. Chandler even adds in that he will not use it against Matt. So they shake on it, and Matt targets Chandler with the demonstrated copy. Matt gets back Frey Elise and Phyrexian Arena, and gains 8 life. Chandler will get back Dovin's Veto, and gains 2. And after this, Matt will move to combat, and swing for 3 commander at Chandler. The turn is then passed to Shelby, who will gain 2 on his upkeep, and he'll get a counter on As Foretold. He then plays Path of Ancestry as his land for turn, and then moves to combat, and swings for 6 Vigilance at Elspeth. The attack trigger will get back his Authority of the Consuls, and Chandler will gladly chump block. After this, Shelby will cast his commander, Oloro, and then pass the turn to Ethan. And Ethan will immediately cast a Wolfgar of Icewind Dale. Ethan will also give it a 1/1 counter, and when Shelby gains that life, he pays 1 so that everybody loses a life, and he draws a card. Ethan will then move to combat and swing with Hans Eriksson at Elspeth, and he'll get 2 triggers off of this. His first reveal is a Heroic Intervention, which will go to hand. And his second is a Port Raiser, which he will have go at Chandler to try to get that extra combat step. When it enters, Shelby will gain a life, and Ethan will put a 1/1 counter on the Port Raiser, and Hans Eriksson and the Razor will fight each other. Moving on to blocks, Chandler will gladly chump block. He'll put 1 under Hans Eriksson and 2 under the Razor to try to kill it. Ethan, not wanting to lose his Port Raiser, will Mending Touch it to regenerate it. And after a pretty decent turn, Ethan will pass to Chandler. Chandler will play a Swamp as his land for turn, and then cast a Contagion Engine. The cast trigger will proliferate Elspeth, and when it enters the battlefield, he'll choose to put a neg1 counter on all of Ethan's creatures. And all the creatures that had plus counters will have them cancelled out. Chandler will then cast an Assassin's Trophy, targeting Shelby's Authority of the Consuls. When he casts it, he'll proliferate Atraxa and Ethan's -1/-1 counters. Even though Shelby would be shuffling away his Approach of the Second Sun, there's no way he could get to it and cast it next turn, and Chandler would be able to hold up a Dovin's Veto the rest of the game. So he decides to go ahead and find a basic island to the battlefield. Chandler will then uptick Elspeth to get 3 more 1/1s, and then he'll move to combat and swing 5 commander at Shelby. Chandler will move to his end step, proliferate Elspeth and the minus counters, and then pass to Matt. And Matt will start his turn off by playing a Fabled Passage and immediately cracking it. And he'll find another swamp. He'll then activate Cabal Coffers for 4 black, and then completely tap out to make a total of 9 mana. He will then drop an Entwined Tooth and Nail. And while this is very alarming for the rest of the table, Matt states that with his current board state, he can't find anything that'll win him the game. Ultimately, he decides to find a Beledros Witherbloom and a Yawgmoth Thran Physician. 2 creatures that go very well together if you ask me, especially with the Chatterfang out. And I'm sure as you could have guessed, he will immediately pay 10 life to untap all of his lands. He'll then pay another life and sacrifice his Llanowar Elves token to put a neg1 counter on Ethan's Port Raiser and to draw a card. After this, he will activate Cabal Coffers again and then pay 2 green to cast Frey Elise with an extra black floating. He'll then upticker to make a Squirrel and a Llanowar Elves. With that black floating, he'll pay another black to discard his Phyrexian Arena and activate Yawgmoth to proliferate his Frey Elise, his Squirrel, and Ethan's Port Raiser counter. He'll then move to combat and swing for 3 at Chandler again, who has no choice but to take it. Matt will then move to his end step and make a Pest and a Squirrel. The turn is then passed to Shelby, and on Shelby's upkeep, As Foretold will get another counter and he'll gain 2 more life. He'll also pay 1 mana to drain everyone and draw a card. And using As Foretold, Shelby will free cast a Dimir Signet. After this, he'll cast a Chromatic Lantern. He'll then move to combat and repeat the swing from last turn. The combat trigger will bring back Authority of the Consuls, and Chandler will chump with a 1/1 soldier. And after this, he'll just pass the turn to Ethan. Matt will make a Pest and a Squirrel, and unfortunately Shelby forgets about Authority of the Consuls. Ethan will start his turn off with a Kessig Wolfrun as land for turn. He'll then move to combat and swing Hans Eriksson and Port Razor at Chandler. His first flip is a Munvali Beast Tracker. When it enters, Shelby will gain a life and pay 1 to drain everyone and draw a card. When the Beast Caller enters the battlefield, Ethan will get to search for a creature and put it to the top of his library. The Beast Caller will also enter with a +1/+1 counter. And Ethan, wanting to go for the kill here, puts a Blightsteel Colossus on top. Chandler tries to convince Ethan that Matt is a way bigger threat in this situation, and that killing Chandler with the Blightsteel Colossus will essentially set up Matt to win next turn. But that is a negative Ghost Rider, and Ethan puts the Blightsteel Colossus on top and moves to resolve Hans' second trigger. The Blightsteel will come in with an extra +1/+1 counter and fight Hans Eriksson, who will die to the infect damage. Also when it enters, Shelby will gain a life and drain everyone by paying a mana again, and Ethan will have the Blightsteel Colossus attacking Chandler directly. Matt, wanting to ensure that Chandler dies, will sacrifice 2 of his pests and a squirrel to kill 3 of Chandler's 1/1s. He'll only lose 1 life from this thanks to the pests and draw 3 cards. Chandler will then put Atraxa underneath Blightsteel Colossus and his 1/1 under the Port Razor. But before damage, Ethan will activate Kessig Wolfrun, X is equal to 2, so that Chandler will get exactly 10 poison counters. Shelby will then attempt to Swords to Plowshares the Blightsteel Colossus, but Ethan still has that heroic intervention, so he casts it. And so damage is dealt, and Chandler will die. Ethan will then pass the turn, and Matt will make 2 tokens on Ethan's end step. And Shelby forgets about Authority of the Consuls again. Now in his turn, Matt will start off with the Champion of Lambholt. It'll enter tapped, and Shelby will gain a life, and he'll pay 1 to drain everyone and draw yet another card. Matt will then play an Urborg, which is very scary. After this, he will Ultimate Freyalise and draw 9 cards. He'll then tap for 2 to cast a Cryptolith Riot. After this, he'll activate his Cabal Coffers to make a total of 8 black mana. He'll use 6 of it to cast Liliana Dreadhorde General, and he'll downtick her to make each player sacrifice 2 creatures, and when he sacrifices 2 of his tokens, he'll gain a life from 1 pest and draw 2 cards. With 2 black floating, he will float another one, and then pay 10 life to untap all of his lands. After this, he will re-tap out all of his lands, and then tap 3 Squirrels, Beledros Witherbloom, and Yawgmoth to cast a Torment of Hailfire, X is equal to 16. Shelby will discard 4 cards and sacrifice his Dimir Signet and lose 33 life. Ethan has to sacrifice all 5 of his non-land permanents and discard the last card in his hand and lose 30 life. Matt will then swing for 6 at Ethan while he's defenseless to kill him. Matt will then discard down to hand size, and Shelby asks to see his graveyard. Matt will then pass the turn to Shelby, make 2 tokens that come in tapped, and Shelby will gain 2. Then, on Shelby's upkeep, he will gain 2 more and get another counter on As Foretold. Now in his main phase, Shelby will tap completely out to cast an Eternal Dominion. He searches Matt's library for something that could potentially get him out of this situation. Ultimately, he really doesn't find too much, so he decides to grab an Avenger of Zendikar. He'll make 6 0/1s and then pass the turn to Matt, who will make 2 more tokens on his end step that come in tapped, and Shelby will gain 2 life. Matt decides to just go ahead and end the game and hard casts a Craterhoof Behemoth. And while it does enter the battlefield tapped and Shelby gains a life, everything on Matt's board will get +13/+13 in trample, and that is more than enough for Matt to swing out and absolutely decimate Shelby, making Matt today's winner. Well guys, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed the game. Let us know what you thought in the comments down below. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. By the way, we're thinking about answering some of you guys' questions for an upcoming video. If you'd like to ask anything, there'll be a link to our YouTube community post and Twitter post down in the description. The links for the deck lists will also be there if you want to check them out. But as always, you guys, thank you so much for watching and have a smooth day.